to attend. Maybe our brothers and sisters in Asia have already emailed me asking for the recording. So let's get started. Jenny.
We want to start today with asking the question, why tell stories? If you think about it, stories are intrinsic to who we are as human beings. We've been telling stories since the very beginning. You could even consider cave paintings as some of our first stories. And today's stories continue to saturate our culture. They're in books, every movie, music, dance, and even visual art is telling a story. So at our core, we're drawn to the telling of stories. And stories can do a lot. They can teach us lessons. They help pass down information. If you've ever been a part of an oral culture that has that oral tradition of passing down history, they can persuade or motivate us to action. They help us empathize. And scientifically, they actually help us connect with others emotionally, like our brain waves are lighting up in the same ways. And throughout history, stories have been used to start movements and revolutions. And there's a reason why we've heard the pen is mightier than the sword. Martin Luther King used a story about two children playing together, one black, one white. And that story gave fire to the civil rights movement in the United States. And it was only a few lines long. We want to tap into that similar power when sharing with potential partners, or for some of you when teaching others how to put stories together. And we want to invite people into ministry. And we want to invite them to play an important role in the ministry story.
Yeah, so we're going to look at three specific types of stories. And the first one is a calling story. And a calling story tells people how you have been called. It's where we talk about the specific events, conversations, relationships, and other things that God has used to lead us to serve in whatever capacity we're serving. It's a great way to personally connect that ministry to you and your involvement. We want to help you create a version of your calling story that is more focused and compelling, and that will leave people really excited to hear more about the ministry. And I'd like to share an example of a calling story with you. In the fall of 1999, I walked into the chapel service of Hillsdale College, not realizing that everything I knew was about to change. It seemed like a normal chapel service. We were in the gymnasium. We were sitting on bleachers. It wasn't very comfortable. And there was music. But there was something different that day, and we had a special speaker that day. And she was with an organization called English Language Institute China. And she got up and she started to speak. And really the strangest thing happened when she started to speak. It's like I couldn't hear a word she was saying. It was like somebody had put their hands over their ears, you know, that feeling where it's all muffled. And it was in that time that she was speaking and that I really couldn't hear or understand what she was saying, that God was speaking to me and challenging me to give my life to him in a certain way. And it was really clear to me that he wanted for me to go overseas and teach English in Asia. And I'm sure that we went back and forth because I was like, God, this must be some mistake. I don't think that's something that I want to do. And by the end of that lady speaking, there was just no denying that God was telling me this is what he wanted for me. After she speaking, it's like the hands came off my ears, and I looked around, literally, I looked around to see if anyone else was having the same experience I was, because it was so strange. And I don't think anyone else was. But I left that service, that chapel service, knowing where God wanted me to be and what he wanted me to do. And really, I was just waiting for him to tell me when he wanted me to go. So telling a good story is like taking a good photograph. In a photo, you have to think about what's going to be included in the shot and where the focus is going to be. And it's the same concept in storytelling. So we suggest 4 storytelling guidelines to help us tell powerful stories. And this applies to all 3 types of stories. The first thing we need to do is focus on a specific incident. We focus by telling people in our very first sentence when, where, and who the story is about. When, where, and who the story is about. For my story, I started off in the fall of 1999. I walked into a chapel service at Hillsdale College. So when, fall of 99, who, it was me involved, and where, in a chapel service at Hillsdale College. What this does is gives an immediate picture for the person listening to actually see where we're at. And that allows them to follow the whole story because they actually have a starting point, a picture in their mind, right? So if a calling story is about a time when you were reading a missionary biography and you felt compelled to go, then start by telling us something like, I was reading in bed one night when I was in high school. The focus of my calling story is when, one evening in high school, where I was in my bed, and then who, it was me that's involved. Usually calling story involves at least you, maybe some other people. The second step is to crop the story to the right length. Experience has taught us that when telling a verbal story, 2 minutes is often the right length. So as you begin meeting people and telling them your stories, you may find that the right length is slightly different for you, but as best as you can, try to keep it right around 2 minutes. If we only have 2 minutes, we really need to think about what details we will include in the story, as well as the details we need to leave out in order to help people see what we are actually focusing on. And that's so important. It's just as important to decide which details to leave out as it is to which details to leave in. The next step of telling a good story is to develop a good ending line. I want to ask you this question. What can happen if we haven't thought about how to end the story? Many times we might keep rambling. Our listeners might be confused as to actually when the story is over. And we might end up drawing several conclusions to the story and lose the impact of the story. It then becomes not powerful. It becomes a very bland story. I love developing a good ending line because I know it's where I'm going to land the plane. So if I know where I'm starting, I know my focus, and I know my ending line, I know I can tell a good story in between there, right? Before we even begin the story, actually, we want to develop a good ending line so we know where to land. For example, in a calling story, it might be something like, from that moment on, I knew that I was going to be involved in missions, or it might be something similar to mine. I left that chapel service knowing what God had wanted me to do, where he wanted me to go, and I was just waiting on when he wanted me to go. The final thing we want to do is use color. It's kind of like when you've taken a photo on your phone and then you have all those filters to choose from. The filters don't really change the content of the photo, but they just give it flavor. It's the same thing when telling a story. This is about making the story more vibrant. You can tell this by using the 5 sentences. What did you see, hear, smell, taste, feel? Choose your words in such a way that you're painting the picture for the person listening, so they can really follow and engage with you. So I want to listen to another example of a calling story, and I'm going to let Jenny do that.
I was cozy in bed on a chilly Sunday morning until I heard a strong voice say, "Wake up." I shot straight up, looked around the room, and felt a voice in my spirit say, "It's time for the next step." You see, over the previous couple of months, my husband and I had noticed that our lives were suddenly quite mobile, and we had a feeling God was up to something. So I got out of bed, got ready for church, eager to find out what the next step was. Now, my husband, Aaron, had arrived at church a couple hours early to practice for worship. And unbeknownst to me, our pastor, Jamie, said to him, "You should pay special attention to this service." This service ended up being, the entire service ended up being about this missions organization that sent teachers into Asia. And they showed a beautiful black and white video of teachers sharing their experiences, and woven throughout was the testimony of a student who had come to Christ through one of those teacher relationships. And at the end, all I could think was, that's great. That is so wonderful that someone is doing that. There was literally nothing that resonated with me until my husband Aaron leans over and says, oh, I think Jamie thinks we should do this, and then walks off to go play keys. And I'm staring after him, processing what he said, and it hits me. And I go, oh no, God, please tell me this is not the next step you're talking about. And I sat there and prayed, and I knew that it was, and I just started crying. With my hands in my head, I sobbed and said, God, if this is what you have for us, you have to change my heart because I'm not ready. And that's exactly what he did. It took a few months. It took battling with physical pain and challenges until one Good Friday, I stumbled into the dimly lit chapel, grabbed the first chair I could find, and said, fine, I give up. I surrender. Whatever you have for us, we'll go. I get it. I'm not in control. And a few weeks later, I woke up, and my husband, who isn't normally awake before me, was in the kitchen, and he said, hey, so while you were sleeping, I applied for a 2-year teaching position in Asia. I looked at him as he's wincing, and I laughed, and I said, okay, I wasn't thrilled, but I was ready.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Jenny. Incredible story. You know, one final note about the calling story is you can avoid sharing every detail that got you where you are. Remember the first guideline, focus on a specific incident. Let's take Jenny's story, for example. She started with that Sunday morning, but jumped back just a little to a couple of months earlier, and then later jumped forward a few months. But the main focus remained that Sunday morning, right? Resist the urge to share just a chronological list of every event, and try to keep it focused to that one moment when you knew you were committing to your current ministry. We're going to listen to another kind of story, a need story. Jenny, am I telling that one or are you telling that one?
Actually, I've asked Deb to join us.
Oh, great.
So it says Kylie, but ignore that. Her name is Deb Evans, one of our amazing coaches and trainers. So I've asked her to join and share her story.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it was winter exam week at Cornell University, and I was asleep at my apartment under a mound of blankets when my phone rang. Deb, I want to jump. I was still half asleep, but the voice sounded familiar. Julie, I asked, is that you? Yes, I think I failed my last exam, and I can't face my parents, so I'm heading to the bridge. And I flung off the covers, and I jumped out of bed, and I said, Julie, where are you? And she said, I'm at my apartment, but I'm about to walk out the door. Still in my pajamas, I reached for my coat. I can be there in 10 minutes. Please promise me that you're not going to go anywhere until I can get there. And I ran to the door, and I shoved my feet into my boots, and I grabbed my keys. And as I drove, I was praying that God would get me there in time and that he would give me the words that she needed to hear. There was a sound of desperation in Julie's voice and a sense of urgency that I just couldn't ignore. You see, Ivy League universities are filled with valedictorians and salutatorians. And that means that students who have been used to being at the top of their classes all of their lives are suddenly like number 962 or number 3,962. And the rigor of college courses combined with the pressure to succeed is really breeding a culture of kids that are fixated on what their futures hold and their grades. And so they're ashamed of failure, and they're anxious. And when they're pushed to the limit, either by ideals that are placed on themselves or by their parents, they make their way to the Thurston Avenue Bridge. And year after year, despite the rails and the nets that are designed to prevent them from jumping, they plunge 125 feet to their deaths at one of the most beautiful gorges I've ever seen. And Julie was in my small group Bible study. If she, as a Christian, questioned her worth, what does that say about kids who don't know their true identity?
Thank you, Deb. The first kind of story we introduced you to was a calling story, one specific to the ministry you're stepping into. The story Deb just shared is what we call a need story. And one of the key elements of a need story is that it leaves the problem unsolved. Hey, do you feel that tension at the end of hearing that story? Like, Julie needs help, and so many of these students need help. Deb also has these really powerful pictures. Whenever we do other trainings, we show people these pictures, and it has a picture of the bridge, and it has a picture where you see the rails, and it actually has written out on chalk in huge letters. It says, if you learn anything at Cornell, Deb, you're making me cry, learn to ask for help. Okay, so our stories can do wonders to give people that mental image, but if you have pictures like that that are so powerful and coincide with your stories, definitely have them and share them and bring people into that world, whether it's a calling story or a need story. But we want to leave it unsolved. It's tempting to add one or two more sentences to wrap it up in a little bow, be like, oh, and now everything's great. You know, now we were able to talk and disciple, and they've come to Christ, and, you know, they're free. And we'll, you know, you can share that later, but in that moment, you want to leave it unsolved so that they're feeling that burden of, we need to take action. Okay, if you've been with us for very long, you've probably heard us say the hero is only as good as the villain is bad. Okay, if the problem is already solved, then why does this ministry exist, right? So we want to make people very aware and have that feeling of the problem is not solved and we need to do something together, okay? So why is this type of story important? I'd love to hear from some of you guys in the chat. You know, what do you think this type of story does? What does it communicate? What kind of action do you think it spurs? So just kind of drop into the chat why you think something like this might be important. We'll just wait a couple seconds and see what you guys have to share.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think this story, why is this kind of story is so important? And Deb, thank you for sharing that story with us. It's really powerful.
Yes.
Really powerful.
You're welcome.
I've removed myself from sharing need stories as much as possible because I just cry through all of them.
Yeah.
Not very helpful from the listener side. Yeah, it compels people's hearts to want to do something or be a part of something. And that's really what we want, right? We're inviting people into this ministry. It's not just about us. We want them to be a part of it. It certainly grabs attention. Absolutely. And it's important because it grabs their heartstrings. And that's another important part of stories. You know, earlier I mentioned that empathy that can be built. And we know that when we hear these stories, you know, when you've heard the challenges, it's probably a big part of why you're going as well, because you're realizing there's a problem. There's a world without Christ, and we have Christ and we want to share it. And it motivates us, but it motivates our partners as well.
You know,
Jen, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, whenever I'm meeting with a potential financial partner or a current one, these need stories are so important because I really want them, after I share the need, I want them to say, I hope we're going to do something about this. Like they're hoping that there's more because they can't stand that there are people that need answers. They need hope. So this need story is such a powerful tool.
Yeah. So Russell's going to share an example of this story as well. And, you know, listen for those story guidelines, but also listen how he leaves that problem unsolved and what difference that makes inside of you as you listen.
So a few years ago, I boarded a plane to Brussels, and I had the opportunity to sit by a young lady named Liddy. Liddy was a French young lady, and she was actually returning home after teaching at Penn State, and she actually taught African American history, which I thought was incredibly interesting. But she was coming back because she couldn't get her visa renewed for some reason. Well, I wanted to know about her experience in the United States, and so I just started asking some questions, and the experience she had and what she liked and didn't like. And not too long into that, our conversation turned a little more spiritual. She said, some friends of hers had invited her to a church, and so she went to a church service while she was in America. And at that, at the church service, she said she just felt this warmth of family that she hadn't felt in a long time. And she said everyone was just full of joy and connected to each other. And she said the reason why they invited her is because some of her friends were being baptized. So she also got to see them be baptized. So I said, that's fantastic. What did someone explain to you what baptism is about? She said, no, actually, no one explained to me really anything about the experience. And so I began to tell her what baptism was about, that we have sin in our lives and we all know that we've fallen short of our Creator, and that Christ came, God's Son, to actually make a way for us to have a eternal relationship with God, and that we would be with Him in heaven for eternity after we die. And she looked at me and she said, I hope you don't think I'm stupid, but I've never heard that before. And I thought, how many more people are out there that have never heard about Jesus?
Thank you. One of the things we love about stories, there are many things, but one of them is that it doesn't have to be your own personal experience of a story for it to still be powerful. If you don't have a need story related to the ministry you're going to be involved in, find one. Maybe your organization's website has stories and communication pieces they send out. Maybe the team that you're joining has shared stories in newsletters that you can ask and get permission to share those. Maybe there's even a story in the news that illustrates, especially if you are working with refugees. Right now, there are a lot of stories in the news that you could pull from to help communicate what the need is. So if you don't have your own story, seek it out. Connect with people who might be able to share, because even though it's not your story, if it's a story of a real person with a real problem that we can be a part of helping, it's going to be powerful. So take a few seconds. If you have notes, write down. If you have an idea of a need story, great, jot that down. If you need to find one, maybe start to even make notes on who you could connect with and where you could go to find that story.
So the first type of story was the calling story. The second is a need story. And the final type of story is an impact story. The impact story is a story that shows the power of the ministry, what God is doing through a ministry. And I want us to listen to an example.
Deb, would you mind sharing the impact story with us? Give her a second to jump back in.
Sure. Yes.
Put her on the spot.
This happened in Czechoslovakia, where Carl and his wife were invited to a weekly course learning about the New Testament. And Carl was pretty dismissive at first, and he didn't really want anything to do with the course, but his wife made him go. And on this particular night, the Holy Spirit was the topic. So after the course, Carl went home and went to bed. But he started dreaming about a tree that was tall and had its roots deep in the ground. And around the roots, there were black worms that appeared. And they started to ravage the roots. And in his sleep, he interpreted the dream in such a way as that he was the tree, and the worms were the envoys of the devil who wanted to kill him. It was such a vivid dream that in his sleep, Carl defended himself by kicking the worms, and he woke himself up. He was in a cold sweat and he was terrified. But after a while, he thought it was just a terrible dream, and then he fell asleep again. But as he slept, the same dream kept coming back even more intensely. And he wasn't only kicking the worms, but he was also screaming. And he woke up and he knew the dream was just not a normal nightmare. That God was speaking to him. And so he decided that he needed to do something about his life, but he would wait until the morning. He got into his bed and he fell asleep again. And after a while, that same dream returned. And this time, the horror of death came upon him. His own desperate screams and kicking awakened him once more. And without hesitating at all, and even though it was in the middle of the night, he jumped out of his bed and he went to find the course leader, who was actually at his house sleeping. Carl woke him up and immediately told him about his dream, and they began to pray together, and they fell to their knees, and Carl gave his life to the Lord. And today, Carl is one of the organizers of these New Testament classes in the Czech Republic, and he's witnessing to all kinds of people and seeing the transforming power of the gospel.
Wow. I love that. Everyone loves a good impact story. That's amazing. Now for those of you who are brand new to a ministry, or you're new to the area in which you're serving, you might have to get a little bit creative. Is there someone else doing similar work in that area? A similar work in the area that's been successful that you can share stories from that? Is there someone doing the work in a similar culture, maybe a surrounding country, that have stories of impact? And of course, if you're brand new to a ministry, but the ministry's been there a long time, then of course you can ask leadership or teammates for different stories as well. If you can't find something that is from your specific ministry and your specific location, find something as close as you can to help people see how this ministry can have an impact in people's lives. I want to share one more example with you. It was a really hot, and I mean really hot afternoon, where I was sitting around my dining room table with Jeff and a student of ours named Sai. We were just finishing our last Bible study, and I should be ecstatic at this point. Several months earlier, my wife and I actually landed in Laos. We went to a language school to learn the basics of the language. We started teaching at a university, and a team had actually been working in that university for 5 years, and not one student had ever agreed to doing a Bible study with them as a teacher. And here we were at the last Bible study with Sai. I should be ecstatic, but I was really dreading it. The weeks leading up to this, Sai just didn't seem interested. Every single time, he just didn't seem interested in what the Bible had to say. And it was just really discouraging for me. But we got to the last study, and I just thought, Lord, if something's going to happen, you're going to have to do it. So we started sharing about the resurrection of Christ, and his eyes definitely changed. I could see God working in his face. As he heard about forgiveness of sin, as he heard about new life in Christ, as he heard about the opportunity to leave the bondage of the spirits that he was serving and move into a relationship and a freedom with Christ. I just saw it all over him. And after we finished reading and discussing, I said, Sai, what do you think? He said, Russell, if this is true, if I can have forgiveness of sins and I can be free in Christ, this changes everything. I said, yeah, Sai, it really does change everything.
Thank you, Russell. All right, so we know we've got some questions that are popping up. If you have questions around storytelling, if you have, maybe you're even thinking, oh, I wonder if this is a good starting line or a good ending line, feel free to put that in the chat. We'd love to take a look and give some feedback. But if you have a question, remember that Q&A box is the best place to list those. It's a little easier for us to keep track of. But go ahead and ask whatever questions you might have in that box, and then comments in the chat. Kylie, you got anything for us?
Yeah. Elena asked a question back when we were talking specifically about the need story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is an excellent question. That the question is, different cultures react differently. So some cultures are used to seeing a huge need all the time. What do you do then? What if you're from a country that is used to pain and crisis?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
That's a great question.
Yeah. Your need still should be highlighted in some way. Something that might be even more powerful is to ask them what need they've experienced.
Right.
And they can share the story. And if they're already deeply connected to it, you can say, yes, and that is what this ministry is addressing. Like, you may not even have to bring up your own story. You can just say, what has your experience been with this?
Right.
And have them share. And then and then just move, right into what the ministry is going to do to solve that problem.
Yeah. Or your need story might only be spiritual too as well, and not have to do with physical needs. That could be a situation where that would work. But that's a great response, Jenny.
Yeah, that's a good question.
And Elena,
if that doesn't answer it, feel free to follow up, Elena.
Yeah, I would even suggest that there may be a situation like you described where the need story maybe isn't even necessary.
Yeah.
It still needs to be, that point needs to be established. But, I mean, I had responsibilities going on, but Deb's story about the Czechoslovakian dream. I mean, when a guy comes to you and knocks on your door and wakes you up in the middle of the night and tells you about this dream, you don't really need to go back and establish the fact that, sin is real and, God, and, I mean, there was already a need established. So it might be that in the situation that you described, all you have to do is just acknowledge it and go straight into an impact story, because people are already looking for solutions. If I'm living with a villain, then you don't need to convince me that a hero coming by is something I should take advantage of. So Great question. I've got another question that I've been thinking about. If anyone else has any, please throw them in the Q&A or chat box. But as you guys were sharing, all of this just sounds really emotional and big. And I know you kind of talked about how it doesn't have to be your own personal experience, but what suggestions do you guys have if my life just is boring? I mean, I'm just more of a logical, what A plus B equals C. This is what I do. God called me. Yep. So what suggestions do you have if I just don't feel like my experiences are just over the top?
That's a really good question.
Well, I mean, I think the answer really lies in the definition of impact, right? How God is working in people's lives in both big and small ways. We talk about that definition in our training. So it doesn't have to be big. It can be small. We can talk about the impact that we see is happening at my local school through my Good News Club, because I know you're involved. Your family's involved in that. It may not seem huge, but God is working, and so we need to find out where God is working and share that with people to inspire them and encourage them. So obviously, the other opportunity is to take a look at other people's stories. Now, when you're talking about your calling story, you have, if you're a missionary or if you're decided to join a ministry of some sort, there's going to be a point in your life where you have to make that decision, and how you came to that decision is probably your calling story, even if it doesn't seem as exotic as other people's. So, Kylie, you're not so boring. I know you're not so boring.
And that's the other thing that's really amazing about stories is like when you strip away all the extra that doesn't move the story forward, it's amazing how what seems boring can actually be quite compelling.
That's true.
At our last training, we were working with a couple, and both of them were like, there were like a million moments to the calling, and there wasn't a big moment. And we worked really hard. It took a lot of kind of back and forth, but started like asking questions. Okay, so when did you say, yes, we'll do this one thing? And they're like, well, I mean, we're having a conversation. Okay, with who? Okay, where were you when you were having that conversation? Okay, how did you feel when you were having that conversation? So I just started asking questions, and they gave details, and I just started, taking notes, and then I read back to them. Okay, so, one sunny afternoon, we were sitting around our kitchen table doing a video chat with George, and then they kind of move in, and they're like, oh yeah, that's it. And so I think it's easy for us to, because we're so close to the information, be like, oh, it really wasn't a big deal. But the reality is your calling is a big deal.
Yeah.
And when we can focus in on those special details, it can actually be compelling. So that's another pitch I want to make to working with the coach, is we can really help you very quickly. And for those of you that are able to take advantage of that free session with Susie, you'll be amazed at how in just 10 to 15 minutes, you can craft a really excellent story. And then to speak to the impact side, when Aaron and I were going to Vietnam, we'd never been, we knew nothing about Vietnam. When I tried to research, all I could find was stuff about the war. That was it. And it was like, oh my gosh, like, what are we even going to tell people? Like, we don't know anything. We're just like, I don't know. God said go, so we're going. But we connected with the team. We started asking questions. We, kind of got some stories that we were able to share. And even though, again, they weren't our stories, our hearts were already starting to be pulled towards these people that we'd never met before. And our partners' hearts followed, so to be able to see, like, when I shared this story and, I'm already kind of an emotional, like, person when it comes to stories, I get so connected. My partners felt that as well. And so I think that's another really powerful piece, is we can share that connection with other people.
Yeah. So Elena's got another terrific question. Man, she's throwing some good curveballs at you guys.
Keep it coming.
She says, thanks for the previous answer, but in our culture, money and goodness do not go together. If you are doing goodness, you don't talk about money. If you talk about money, you are not doing goodness. How do you break the circle of this stereotype?
Yeah. Well, first, knowing the culture, you obviously know the culture, you're there living in it. And so how do they talk about money? If you were in need of help, okay, you were stranded somewhere and you needed help, how would you ask for it? And you can model similarly when it comes to money. I know that in, where was it? One of the Central American countries. I'd asked, well, how does it work when you want to raise money? And they said, well, we have an event and people come and they just know. And so kind of using that as a starting place of, okay, where do we see money flowing? How does this work? And then there are ways where you can do it where you're sharing the story and maybe you're not asking directly, but there is that implication. So it's not about manipulating people, and it's not about taking, an American culture and applying these principles, but looking at what does it take to encourage generosity?
Yeah.
And mapping out a course for that.
I've had the opportunity to actually train in over 25 different cultures where, they were from that culture and they were raising money in that culture, whether that's South America, Africa, Asia, even in Europe. And I've never met somebody from either one of those continents that said, it's easy to ask for money in our country. People like to talk about it. There's not a country, even the US, where it's probably the most prominent. It doesn't mean that it's easy for people to talk about it. So I just want to give you some hope in that you're not alone. But I also want to give you hope in that there is a way. And Olena, I would really encourage you to sign up with Susie for that free coaching session and really work through this. How am I going to invite people to give in this type of context? I think that would be great. And if for everyone else, if you haven't signed up for your free session with Susie and you haven't experienced a tailored coach before, then please do that. I know it will be worth it. So.
Yeah, I just want to add real quick, great answers. And I do think some more time with the coach could help, but I just want to tag on to Jenny's answer and comment. I think really a lot of times as fundraisers, we get caught up on the fact that I need money when that needs to move away from the focus and really, your role is more about cultivating generosity in your partnership base than it is just getting money.
Right.
So I know it's more complex than that, Elena, but I think maybe a beginning point is to keep in mind that the conversation you're trying to have is not about how can I convince you to give me money, but it really is more about, God is the owner of everything. Right. And he's been generous with us. And, where are you in your life in terms of cultivating generosity? So, yeah.
And that it truly is an opportunity. I mean, this is something you can be a part of, and here's how this looks. One of the things we do in trying to reframe this mindset, and everything in the kingdom seems to be upside down, from where where we think. But part of that upside down is that we're not taking something from people. We're actually giving them something. We're giving them an opportunity to be a part of what God is doing in this city, in this country, in this world. And we know that there's a blessing for that. We know that when they're generous and they sacrifice to advance the kingdom, that they're going to be blessed for that. And so not using that to manipulate, we don't want that. But if you truly believe that and can help educate yourself on it and then educate your partners and say, hey, here's this really difficult thing that we're all very aware of, but did you know about this ministry? And here are the things that they're doing, and here's the impact that we're seeing, and we want more people to get involved. And here's what that looks like. What do you think? And just inviting them into that. And I'll agree with Russell. Like, we've worked with a lot of people in a lot of different cultures. Most of them have taken this approach and tried it, and it has worked.
There are some nuances, and some nuances specifically. Yeah, there's some nuances. Even Kylie and I have actually, Olayda, I know you work in Turkey, and Kylie and I have actually been to Turkey to work with a ministry there and to help them do this as well. So I know it seems challenging. It might even seem impossible, but there are ways.
Yeah, I was working with a client in the Netherlands, and they said, "Oh, we don't do this here." I was like, "We don't do it here either. It's why no one has any money." I said, "But the people we've seen who do, and who are thinking through it and being really intentional in how to inspire generosity and invite people to be a part of it, like they're actually seeing their partner team grow. They're seeing funding increase. It's less about being direct and more about being clear."
That is so good, Jenny. That is so.
It's amazing how it's easy to go, oh, well, that's really direct, and I'm in an indirect culture. But it's different when we're just clear. Right. We can be clear about what the need is. We can be clear about what the impact is, and we can be clear about how they can be a part of it. It actually makes it so much easier.
Right.
And even my Canadian friends who have, done this in Canada, where it was like, oh, we're so indirect. They were like, oh my gosh, it's working. And people are like, thank you. Like, thank you for just making it easy to say yes and making it easy to say no. Right. No's a totally valid answer. But right. I think just spending time to really focus your words is such a blessing to your partners.
Well, I think that we need to wrap up.
All right.
And I just thank everyone for being on here. I hope it was helpful for you guys. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing around the world. And when you need us, you let us know. We'll be there for you. So we appreciate you so much, and hope you'll have a great rest of your week.
Bless you guys, and happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Have a great week.